Hello, it's a pleasure to make your acquaintance and welcome to Watchful's Imaginarium Theater Guide for version 6.2 and a little bit of 6.1. As usual, we'll run through the characters, elements and acts in a moment, but before we do that I need to highlight a question for this theater. In this theater, many of the featured characters are characters that will be receiving the brand new Hexerei buffs in version 6.2, which makes those characters considerably better. I don't know if you'll be able to unlock and use these buffs for characters you don't own, for example they're given to you as trial characters. But either way, you're likely to own some of the Hexerei characters, so I would personally recommend waiting to do this theater until Hexerei and Durin is released in 6.2, so you can do the challenges with those characters at their full strength. So we can look at the elements. This time around we have Cryo, Pyro and Animo, which are pretty common characters to own. Element-wise, we have a lot of attack scaling characters, and because of the reactions, we also have a lot of characters that want elemental mastery. So let's take a look at the reactions themselves. We're starting off with Melt and Reverse Melt, which are the same reaction, combination of Cryo and Pyro, but it depends on the way round that you're applying these. Difference between a reverse and a forward reaction is two things. Firstly, it changes the multiplier that goes into the calculation for the elemental mastery amplification of the damage. You can simply think of it as that a forward reaction does more damage than a reverse reaction. It amplifies the damage you're doing by more. Difference is that it has a 2 times multiplier going into the calculation for a forward reaction and a 1.5 for a reverse reaction. So the difference isn't huge, but it can add up to a lot. And forward and reverse reactions are nicely intuitive. If you have a fire and you throw a bunch of ice onto it, that's not going to be very effective at putting the fire out, so that's a reverse reaction. Whereas if you want to melt some ice and you put a big fire next to it, that's going to be very quick in melting the ice and super effective at doing so. And so that is a forward reaction. The same thing applies to Hydro. It's a lot easier to put out a fire with water than put out water with a fire. The other aspect of the reaction that's a bit more complicated is to talk about aura. This is because forward reactions are more greedy than reverse reactions. If you're putting out that fire, you don't need a lot of water to put out all of the fire, so it will consume more pyro. On the other hand, if you want to get rid of all of the water, you will need a lot of fire, or you won't get rid of all of the water. So a reverse reaction only consumes half as much as a forward reaction would. This can change how a lot of teams work. A good example of a character that does forward reactions is Mualani. Mualani consumes a lot of pyro when she hits with her Hydro. She will remove all of the pyro off the enemy, because she's putting water on that fire. And in trade for that, she gets a big reaction multiplier on her damage. But Mualani's kit is designed to work for that. She's only doing about 3 hits, and so you only need 3 applications of Pyro to happen in between those Hydro hits. You apply Pyro, then you vape it. You apply Pyro, then you vape it, etc. And so there's a lot of characters that can do that because you only need a bit of application. You can use Pyro Traveler, you can use Zhangling, even Guoba, you can use Durin, you can use Hu Tao, Mawika, etc. If we look at a character that has faster application though, the situation changes. Say we look at Arcana in a melt team, Arcana with Sitlali. If we try to get reactions as fast as possible with Arcana to get the most damage out of her, hoping that we melt every time, then Arcana ends up triggering those melt reactions and applying Pyro more often than Sitlali is able to apply Cryo to an enemy. So Sitlali can apply Cryo, and then Arcana will attack and get a melt reaction. But if Arcana keeps attacking as fast as she can, then she'll end up putting Pyro on the enemy and trying to trigger a reaction before Sitlali's managed to put Cryo on them. And if you do this, you end up with a Pyro aura on the enemy, which ruins everything. You've applied a Pyro aura to an enemy that didn't have an aura before because Arcana tried to react. Now when Arcana does another reaction, she won't be able to because she'll be applying Pyro to Pyro. On the other hand, Sitlali will try to remove that Pyro. When she tries to put Krai on it, she will trigger a melt reaction. But remember, this is now a reverse reaction, so it's only going to remove half of the Pyro that exists on there. Which means it will not only take her 1, but 2 applications of Cryo to remove all of the Pyro. You will also then have to wait for another application of Cryo before you get a Cryo aura, so before Arlecchino can get another reaction. And because it's 2 seconds between the time that Sitlali applies the Cryo, you have to wait a whole 6 seconds if you mess this up. And so getting the wrong aura if you have too much of an element can be disastrous to your team's damage. The way to work around this on Arlecchino is just to wait a little bit. If you wait a little bit after triggering your first reaction for Sitlali to then apply Cryo again, you can ensure that you get as many reactions as possible, and that ends up giving you quite a lot of damage. Even if you are waiting around a little bit, it's better to wait around than ruin the aura on the enemy. But if you wanted something more simplistic, something easier to play where you didn't have to awkwardly wait around, you could start looking at Arlecchino triggering reverse reactions instead. In a Vaporized team, Arlecchino can attack to her heart's content, get as many reactions as fast as possible, but usually that can't keep up with the Hydro, because for every application of Hydro, she needs to do 2 Pyro reactions to remove it. And so you end up triggering slightly more reactions, but the multiplier on them is smaller. Hopefully that wasn't too complicated and you now have a bit more of an understanding about how reactions work. As a side note, you can just throw in a second Cryo character, and that's what teams like Garming often do. The second Cryo character, you get someone else to consistently apply the Cryo, so you're able to react even if you're applying your element more often. And lastly, we have Swirl to talk about. Swirl isn't too complicated. Any character that's triggering swirls, you can give them Viridescent to reduce enemies' resistance, which is very important because not many characters have the access to Resistance Shred. As usual, Viridescent only triggers if the character doing the swirl is on field at the time. The more nuanced aspect of Anemo characters than Swirl is whether you should invest fully into Elemental Mastery or into damage on your characters, and Venti is a very good comparison for this. Old Venti didn't have the best numbers, but triggered a lot of swirls, so building full Elemental Mastery on him ended up giving you more damage. But with the new Hexerei buffs, his numbers are bigger, and so you'll get more damage from just building a typical damage and crit build on him than you would from building full Elemental Mastery. Of course, this changes if you have characters like Sucrose and Kazuha who have innate Elemental Mastery scalings in their kit. That's enough on reactions, let's take a look at the characters, starting off with the characters of significance this theatre. It's Pyro and Cryo. There's one character in the game that's a very strong DPS and is quite obvious for this, Mawika, especially with Sitlali as a support, or Sitlali in general, because she's able to shred so much resistance of the enemy. Those characters will be super strong and be able to carry you through any combat encounter. At the same time, Arlecchino, while she has a little more trouble making use of the melt reactions, she's just a very strong damage dealer in herself. Also have Durin, but keep in mind there's 2 different forms of Durin. There's the one that reduces enemies' resistance, but he won't reduce resistance to Cryo or Hydro. So if you're playing an Anemo damage dealer like Zhao or Wanderer, you might want to go the Resistance Shred version. You press your skill twice. You can also play him as a reaction off-fielder, more like a sub-DPS where he's getting more damage by triggering reactions by having a lot of Cryo or Hydro on the enemy. And here you'll want to skill and then attack. For buffers, we have Bennett being an incredible attack buffer. Sucrose increases everyone's elemental mastery by a lot and is able to swirl elements, reducing enemies' resistance. Escoffia has personal damage, resistant shred, depending on the amount of cryo characters in your team, but it's still something, and really good off-field cryo application, the same amount as Sitlali. As far as characters to borrow, I would definitely choose Mawika or Arlecchino if I didn't have access to them. Some more middling characters are characters like Klee. Klee applies so much Pyro that she very much struggles to trigger reactions. So it's more likely those off-field cryo characters will be triggering the reactions. We only have the availability of one Electro character from the support options, and so Chevreuse won't work with most teams. But her C6 does buff up your character's Pyro damage, even if she doesn't trigger an overload, that's just through her healing. Characters that will definitely not work very well this theatre is Skirk, unfortunately. Skirk doesn't create rifts when you trigger a melt reaction, only from Cryo Swell, so you'll have to play her exclusively in a Cryo and Anemo team. Unless you put Mona in there, and Mona is the only really exception to make this work, because Mualani just doesn't have enough Hydra application to make those teams work well. Eula, or any physical carry, doesn't do a lot of cryo damage, so doesn't get a lot of buffs from that aspect. She also doesn't have access to Superconduct without Fischl, so those carries will generally be weaker. Okay, let's take a brief look at the blessings. The initial Meld blessing is quite useful as it will give you more elemental application depending on the reaction that's triggered. If you're using Mawika with Sitlali, you get a forward melt and then it will apply cryo to help you get more reactions. If you're using Wriothesley with, say, Zhangling, then you'll be triggering a reverse melt, and so it will apply Pyro to help you get more reactions. Down the path of melt, you also have options that reduce enemies' resistance. I generally wouldn't take these because we have Anemo characters this theatre to do so. The side of the Pyro options does quite a lot of damage, but it's at the cost of reducing your HP. Unfortunately, this isn't often enough to make Marechaussee viable on characters. This does apply Pyro to an enemy periodically. It might mess up your reactions sometimes, but also if you're running a team of exclusively Anemo and Cryo, you can still get melt reactions in that team. And therefore those melt reactions will trigger the blessing. Okay, let's take a look at the opening characters. Starting off with Klee, who should have got their Hexerei rework if you're playing her in 6.2, which will make her a lot nicer to use. Her animations are faster. As we mentioned, Klee applies a lot of Pyro from a lot of different sources, so it will be very hard for her to get melt reactions. At worst, if you don't have her built whatsoever, you can just give her Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers and make her a support for another damage dealer. Bennett, of course, you should know, incredible buffer. Not going to say him a lot here, he's a very valuable character. Talking about valuable characters, we also have Sitlali, who offers damage bonus, resistant shred, shielding, cryo application for Pyro characters. She's another incredible character, and it's kind of annoying they give us to her so early. If you want to use Mawika with her, you'll have to wait till the end. If you're looking for a replacement to Sitlali in teams like that, you can use characters like Rosaria. Diona, who's another character we start off with, doesn't have as fast application. She has shielding and healing and a small amount of cryo application, so she's good to pair with another cryo applier, and her C6 gives 200 elemental mastery, which can be nice. Chaska is a bit awkward this theatre. This is because Chaska really likes to have 3 different of the Fek elements in her team, Pyro, Hydra, Electro, Cryo. Having 3 of them gives her more damage on her charge attacks. The only character that would enable that this theatre is Fischl, and even combining those 3 elements will trigger you superconducts and overloads, which aren't the most valuable. I would recommend taking 2 Cryo and 1 Pyro. Doing it this way also means that you'll end up with more cryo on the enemy generally, and so those pyro reactions will be forward reactions and get you bigger damage numbers than going 2 pyro and 1 cryo. Chaska is also very single target until you get to higher constellations. Next we have another one of those super valuable buffing characters, Sucrose. Sucrose has slightly faster animations than Kazuha. She's able to give any character a lot of elemental mastery. She has Viridescent for the resistant shred. You can give her something like Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers to buff up your on-fielder's attack even more if you switch them after Sucrose, which you normally want to do to preserve that Viridescent resistant shred uptime. But you probably don't want to burst on Sucrose. It takes more field time, it requires you to build energy recharge, but more than that, it will probably absorb the wrong element, causing you to mess up the reactions you want to. So unfortunately, this theatre, we have a lot of super valuable characters at the start, meaning the teams you're going to have to think about for later might be using weaker characters, so as usual, plan those out. So have some very fun guest characters this time around, 3 of them being Hexerei characters. The first being Mualani. Mualani is a character that really likes Pyro. It was unfortunate that the last theatre was a Hyperbloom one where she didn't work well at all. So she has a much better setup this time around because of the amount of Pyro characters we have access to, so she's able to consistently trigger that Vaporize. So works very well with Mona to be able to buff up her damage further. Talking about Mona, she's another one of the characters you have access to, a Hexerei character, and with all the Hexerei characters, remember if you want to enable their new buffs, you have to play them with a second Hexerei character. So in a Mualani team, you might want to pair Albedo and Mona, or Sucrose and Mona. Mona also needs a hell of a lot of energy to be able to get her burst consistently. I would highly recommend you give her a fav weapon, Bonius Codex. Mona, when she attacks enemies that have the burst on them, it will extend the duration of your burst, so you need to do 4 attacks to get the max duration of it. For every attack she does, up to 3, she will also increase the reaction multiplier on the enemy. King melts and vaporizes hit harder. Talking about Albedo, we also have Albedo. Albedo is now a pretty good generalist to slot into any team with the buffs, as he buffs up the character's damage that are Hexerei by 42%, and any characters that are not a Hexerei by 12% if you've got enough defense built on him. He also conveniently gives Elemental Mastery from his burst for 8 seconds. Lastly, we have Fischl, who, as we mentioned earlier, works very well with Chevreuse. She's also a good just general damage dealer for whichever character you want to put with her. Just consider the reactions that will be taking place. If you're putting her in a melt team, it might mess up the reactions some way by her triggering superconducts and overloads. Okay, well that's all the characters looked at. Let's briefly go over the general tips like we do every single time. First of all, save your characters for particular stages and particular enemies. Try to plan them out. Know that, say, against one of the last bosses, you'll definitely need X character, so you know you need to not grab them until you get a couple of stages before that. Good balance of damage dealers and supports is nice. You don't want to end up with a team ideally that's 4 damage dealers and as only one of them can attack at a time. Favonius weapons are good to throw on almost any support just to make sure you're meeting those energy requirements and can burst whenever you want to. Building extra energy on characters is also not a bad thing to do, as you don't know the exact teams you'll end up playing them in. Mystery caches should always be taken, because they almost always give you something good. Generally, the early mystery caches, I like to pick ones which give you more mystery cache options, so that when you get the option of getting either a 15 cost mystery cache or a 40 cost mystery cache, which have the super valuable buffs in, you can get the exact ones you want to. Take the blessings dependent on your team. If you have a lot of Pyro and Cryo characters, but not very many Anemo, then you don't necessarily need to take the Anemo buffs and can focus on the melt buffs. If you have the opportunity to, you should always take a strong support character from your friend. They can either just make 2 stages a breeze, or give you access to certain properties for enemies' mechanics. Guest invite characters obviously won't give you access to the blessing buffed reactions, but to compensate for that, they get double the amount of blessing levels. Blessing levels are a big chunk of stats that your characters all get, including Elemental Mastery, Attack, Defense, HP, and you get these for bringing characters over the minimum requirement for each difficulty. Get 2 per character. And every time you pick a blessing, you'll increase your blessing level. Make sure to give your damage dealers the best artifacts they can, as support characters don't contribute as much to the damage. You can just give your support characters like a Noblesse set or a Instructors set, or something very generic, doesn't have to be well invested, just enough to make them functional. For this theatre in particular, because it matters a lot in your teams who's proccing those melt reactions, make sure to keep that in mind when you're constructing your teams and planning your teams. You, for example, wouldn't want a team with Rosaria, Arlecchino, and Xiangling because their Rosaria is getting the melts, not Arlecchino or Xiangling because both of those Pyro characters apply a lot of Pyro. It also means any elemental mastery you built on Arlecchino or Xiangling would be redundant because you're not triggering reactions. That's all of the pre-yapping done, let's get into the acts. As always for the early acts, you want to get rid of the weaker characters if you can. You can save those stronger characters for later. The issue with this theatre is that we have 3 super strong characters at the start, so I would recommend at the start trying to recruit as many characters as possible. In Act 1, the wire was easiest for me because it's single target. We'll need to keep in mind it drains your energy, so you don't want to be burst reliant, and that the extra damage you get from melts don't go through onto the white shield. Otherwise, pick the mechs. The land cruisers and Fatui, even though for their mechanics they want you to do electrocharged or lunar charge, it doesn't actually make you do any more damage, and they're pretty easy to fight, they're very immobile. I would definitely avoid the Lawa Churls because of their high cryo resistance, and the mechs are pretty neutral. And in Act 3 we're facing an enemy that we just faced in Abyss, the Geovishap. This is the Electro version, which is quite odd. because of the Geovishap's only mechanic. Geovishap's mechanic is that at a certain point throughout the fight it will do a large area-wide breath attack, and if you have a shield, you reflect some of the damage back at it. If it's a Geo shield or the element that the Vishap is, it'll take 15% true damage. If it's just a shield in general, it will take 5% true damage. And its resistance is weakened for a very short amount of time, about 4 seconds. The problem is, we don't have any electro shields. The only way I can really see this happening is by using Fischl with Lanyan, applying electro to the enemy and then using Lanyan to generate a electro shield on yourself. You could also do the same thing with Kazuha, swirling the electro from an attack onto the enemy. They're still difficult units to get so early. You have Albedo, Diona, Sitlali, Layla, etc. if you just want a shield on yourself. But the other way of getting access to this is by making your own Crystallize from the enemy's attacks. When it does its simple breath attack, it will apply Electro to you. When it does melee attacks, it will apply Geo to you. Through this process, you can generate Electro Crystallizes off yourself. They drop on the ground, you wait until the mechanic's about to occur, pick them up, you're able to reflect the maximum amount of damage without needing any Electro or Geo characters in your team. And that's the only mechanic to the Primo Geovishap, so let's move on to Act 4. Act 4, as always, is the Monolith stage. Once again, they haven't given us any easy enemies to cheese. You have either a pair of meter churls or a bunch of treasure hoarders at the same time. Unlike last theater, this time we have access to a lot more abilities to be able to stop them attacking the Monolith. The first one being crowd control. Of course, Venti, Kazuha, Sucrose, Haizo, all of those characters and more have the ability to stop enemies moving. You can lift them up in the air, you can pull them off to the side, anything to stop them hitting the Monolith. And against these chambers with many enemies in, swirling actually has a lot of value, because you're able to hit multiple enemies at a time with those swirls, and so you're not only stopping them from attacking, you're also getting good damage on them. For these, I especially recommend fighting the Treasure Hunters and the Fatui Agent, as all of those enemies are light and easy to crowd control. Taking on the Fatui and the Land Cruiser wasn't too bad. You can't control the Land Cruiser, but you can keep its aggro pretty easily. The other option is that this theater in particular, we have access to a lot of taunts. Taunts are abilities that grab aggro from the enemies and so will help distract them from the Monolith while you're attacking them. You have Mona's skill, you have Linny's charge tags, you have Amber's Baron Bunny, Lynette's burst, Ganyu's skill. There's a lot of different options. You'll only need one or two at most to keep most of the enemies distracted. If you're just looking to do damage and didn't go with any of these options, then I would recommend the Meter Charles. Lastly, I also want to mention if you're bringing Mona, or I guess potentially Mulan, you can also do a freeze team. For Act 5, you have the Fungi, Eidolons, and Kairagi. The Fungi, because there's so many of them, ideally you want to take a team with some crowd control, at least very strong AoE damage, but that's not as common in melt reaction teams. Hydra Eidolons, you want a lot of Pyro damage, but remember you can't shred with Viridescent Venera Pyro on a Hydro enemy. You'll just be swirling Hydro. And do it in creative ways like with Bennett and Lynette, or Guoba and Sucrose, or Jean and Bennett. There are some ways that you can reduce enemies' resistance to Pyro, even if you can't apply Pyro to them. Chevros, Durin, Silali, etc. And so for this act I like to pick the Kairagi, because they're the most generic enemies. They're not the heavy kind, so you can still crowd control them. Have any special auras to them. They're just the most simple. In Act 6, we're facing the Aeonblight Drake, and this isn't the same one that we had in a really difficult version of Stygian before. It hasn't got those extra mechanics, it's just the regular Aeonblight Drake. For this one, it will go flying up in the air, and so you'll want to hit either its core in the center of its chest, or the engines on the wings to knock it down. There are creative ways of doing this, like with Farina and Kanish, but we don't have access to many of those characters this theater, so I would recommend just taking a bow character, but there's a lot of bow characters this theater. At a certain point in the combat, it will also start trying to absorb the element it's taken the most damage to. If it successfully does this, it will gain 60% extra resistance to that element. So when it's about to do that, either just shoot it in the face with a bow character or have some kind of ability that targets its face. And that's it. I'm really thankful that not many of the enemies we're facing this theater have very many complicated mechanics. Act 7 is the last of the defeat all of the enemies with no other special mechanics chambers. The mechs are fine to deal with, but they're a bit heavier. Chihuahuan beasts have both Hydro and Anemo resistance. Unless you're taking a character with Night Soul to reduce the resistance of the automaton, I'd avoid that. For this chamber, as usual, I don't mind fighting the more difficult fight, because just by positioning yourself next to the ranged version, the melee one will group themselves over to it, and they're just Natlan warriors. They don't have any special mechanics or resistances to them. After this, you're against the next boss, which is the Suanni. Suanni, just like the Chihuahua beast, has very high Anemo and Hydro resistance. You'll absolutely need to pair this with some character or element that can trigger a reaction on a frozen aura. You freeze an enemy, then you want to remove the freeze. Bringing a melt with Pyro or shattering the enemy will do it instantly. For swirl and crystallize, you might have to do it multiple times to make sure you remove all of the frozen aura on the enemy, but it should still be easy enough to do. Side note, some of the attacks of the Suanni are Hydro, so if you're standing in a Bennett burst, it can one-shot you quite easily. The reason you need to bring those elements and those reactions is for its mechanics. The mechanics last about 10 seconds, and for the duration of them, it has massively increased resistances. Hydro mechanic happens first, and here it infuses itself with Hydro, and will eventually do a big blast of Hydro around the arena. To stop it doing this, as we mentioned, you need to freeze it and then trigger another reaction on it. Second version of the mechanic, it will summon 3 floating Anemo orbs around it. You just need to infuse these orbs with a Feck element, and doing so will end the mechanic. It's also nice to pick a team that has some consistent cryo application, whether that's from on-field or off-field, as periodically some of its attacks will infuse itself with Hydro, meaning you can freeze it and knock it down, stunning it again. Act 9 is the focus round, where you only need to deal with some of the enemies and you can ignore all the minions. Then you have Hydro Eidolons, which come with the same caveats I mentioned earlier. You'll want Pyro damage for free reactions, but you can't trigger Resistance Shred on them as easily. Are easiest enemy-wise, but they also have really high cryo resistance. So as long as you're not relying on cryo damage, I choose them. Otherwise, the Ruin Guards are rarer to find, but are okay to fight. Okay, on to the Arcana stages, as we need to do them next before we do the final boss. The Arcana stage is slightly different this time around. Do still take damage for the duration of this stage. It's only to your active character, it's more in bursts of damage, and it's cryo damage. Though this doesn't apply the element to you, so you just need to worry about the damage itself, and it seems a lot lower when it's not targeting your whole team. A shielder or a healer is useful, especially a cryo shielder, because those shields will last for longer. It can absorb more cryo damage. And while I still think they're necessary, you can get away with someone like Bennett or Diona for this defensive utility. As you get both the flying and the earth drakes, the ones that can absorb the element they took the most damage to, you can take a bow user, just like previous stages, to shoot them in the face to stop them doing this. But you should be killing them so fast, especially if you want the star, that this won't matter. You'll defeat them before this mechanic occurs. Spawn in cardinal directions, and you need to defeat 9 of them instead of the 18 from before. The trade-off for that is that they remove 30 seconds from the timer. So it's still the same amount of time, it's still 2 minutes, even though it starts at 6 minutes, it's still 2 minutes in total that you have to defeat all of the enemies. I will say is that make sure you get near to the Ruin Grader, which is the first one that spawns, as soon as it spawns, to stop it just charging off in the opposite direction. From that, the stage isn't too problematic. The enemies are very static and gives you a lot of energy when you defeat them. To Lunar Arcanum 2, and we have some really annoying enemies to deal with. We have some Consecrated beasts, and I remember there's a lot of trauma from people in the past fighting Abyss Chambers with pairings of Consecrated beasts in. Luckily there's no crocodile here, it's the Scorpion and the Fanged Beast. They appear sequentially after one another. And just like the previous chamber, they do have a mechanic that will occur after a while, but to get the star, you'll probably defeat them before this mechanic occurs. Consecrated beasts have quite high innate resistance, up at 40% and 70% for the element that they are. The mechanic associated with that is that at a certain point throughout the fight, they will summon these small blocks. You need to hit them with 6 elemental hits to break them, all the same element that they are, but we don't have access to Dendro, so 6 hits. This block is out there, their resistances drop a lot as well, all the way down to 10%. To break the block, and you want to do so because then it will do 15% true damage to them of their max health on your next attack to them. They'll be stunned for a little bit and then shortly regain those resistances. Parts of this fight, one, that the enemies move around so much, so location-based abilities take a lot more effort to actually hit, so someone like Sitlali would be a lot more useful than Rosaria. And to pair with that, these attacks that they do have a lot of stagger to them, so it will very easily interrupt what you're doing. You'll want to either get some interruption resistance or stay away from them. The strange thing about this theatre, looking at all the chambers we've been through so far, is a lot of the boss chambers where you'd normally require certain characters to perform certain mechanics isn't really applicable. So many bow characters, and that's the only check. For the Suanni, you want cryo, but that's super easily accessible. Brewing machines, nor these consecrated beasts have any particular element or mechanic you really need to solve to take the most advantage of them. Following on from this, the same thing can be said for the Act 10 boss, the last boss of theatre, the Yumkasaur Mountain King, who they love putting in every single content. We just had this in Abyss. They're not that cringe to deal with, and we do have a perfect team to deal with them. Extra Dendro resistance, and that's irrelevant. And to make the most of them, you need some Pyro application at some points throughout the fight, but it's fairly inconsistent. And ideally, some Cryo or Hydro to pair with that, which we have access to. This is because right away into the fight, it will do some deadly attacks, dodge those, but then it will spawn 3 flame granites on the ground. You hit these with Pyro, they explode. If he eats them before they explode, he takes 5% true damage. If they explode on their own, then he will take a bigger amount of Pyro damage. And because it's Pyro damage, if he has Hydro or Cryo on him before that explosion occurs, then he will take even more damage because those flame granites exploding will melt or react. In theatre, you can't do the trick where you swirl the Pyro he puts on the ground, because he doesn't apply any of that effect to the ground, which makes the fight a bit easier, and you should be bringing Pyro anyway, you have so many characters to pick from. After that, it will likely do its spin attack where it rushes over to one side of the arena, but you can delay it doing its attacks by constantly standing behind it, and it will keep trying to turn to face you in between every attack. You also might want some shielding or interruption resistance to be able to avoid the damage when it spins off to the edge of the arena, or at least move away for it. And if it is doing that attack, keep that in mind and know for like Bennett Burst or Rosaria Burst or Fischl that you'll want to plant them at the location it's going to end up, not where it's currently at. Towards the end of the fight, if it hasn't been delayed too much, it might also do a mechanic where it summons 1 Flame Grate at the end, so just keep that in mind. Apart from that, that's all there is to the Mountain King. So this theatre itself, I think, is quite simple and will be one of the easier ones to do, because you won't have to think about the teams too much. Either way, I hope this helped you. If you found it helpful and think other people would find it helpful, sharing it or commenting or liking to make it more visible on YouTube or any of that stuff is always super appreciated. These videos doing well and more people using them encourages me to keep making more of them over other content. If there's anything I missed, it will be pinned. If there's any important information, you can put it in the comments. Any thoughts, anything to improve this video is always appreciated. And if you want help for more endgame content, feel free to subscribe. Anyway, I've been Watchful, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Bye bye!